I would like to thank Lord Dyson and his team for the report. It is welcome that the BBC accepts Lord Dyson's findings in full, which are extremely concerning. That BBC employees lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
King Charles couldn't hold back tears after William revealed his and Diana's marriage was far nastier. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the title points to something much deeper than a royal family argument. William eventually spoke publicly about the final years of Diana's life, and his words reopened a wound surrounding the marriage of Charles and Diana that had never truly closed. He was not simply describing an unhappy relationship, he was describing what he remembered seeing happen to his mother. Charles and Diana's marriage was already damaged by infidelity, distance, pressure, and relentless public scrutiny. But William's later statement drew attention to something beyond the marriage itself: the fear, paranoia, and isolation surrounding Diana's final years, and the interview later found to have been obtained through serious deception. Now, watch this carefully. The story does not begin with the famous wedding, the affair, or the divorce. It begins much later, when the past came back, with evidence attached to it. In 2021, William condemned the BBC Panorama interview that had become one of the defining moments in the collapse of his parents' public relationship. He said the failures involved had contributed significantly to the fear, paranoia, and isolation he remembered from his mother's final years. And that is where this story becomes painfully personal. William was not a distant commentator looking backward at history. He was the child who had lived inside that history. He had watched his mother's trust erode. He had watched the consequences inside the household. Decades later, an official investigation would establish that the journalist behind the interview had used forged documents and deception to gain access to Diana. Hi viewers, if you had watched your own mother suffer while the world judged her, would you want the truth exposed years later? Type yes in the comments if you would. Because this is not another story about Charles and Diana. It is about what happens when a marriage under pressure becomes surrounded by people who can profit from every fracture. It is about a family trying to contain a private disaster, while newspapers, television producers, and photographers discovered that the disaster itself could become an industry. For years, the public was given a familiar picture. Charles was the older husband whose marriage had failed. Diana was the young woman who became increasingly unhappy. Another relationship stood between them. The press followed every movement. The marriage eventually ended. Diana died the following year. Those facts are real, but they do not explain everything William later confronted. The question is, what happened to Diana while that marriage was collapsing, and whether some of the fear surrounding her was simply the product of an already painful life, or whether others deliberately fed that fear. That question matters because the answer changes the shape of the story.
Displayed woeful incompetence when investigating complaints and concerns about the programme, and were evasive in their reporting to the media and covered up what they knew from their internal investigation. It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said.
If Diana had simply been unhappy, the tragedy belongs mainly to a broken marriage. If she was also being manipulated by people who wanted access to her, the tragedy becomes something far darker. A vulnerable woman could be frightened, isolated, and then watched as she reacted to the very fear others had helped create. That is the mechanism the later investigation exposed. But before that investigation existed, before official findings were written down, there was only a household under pressure and a marriage that had become impossible to hide from the public. Charles and Diana had entered royal life as one of the most famous couples on earth. Their wedding was presented as a national fairy tale. Millions watched. Cameras followed. Every smile became evidence that the marriage was succeeding. Every silence suggested something was wrong. Behind those images, the relationship was becoming increasingly difficult. Charles had his own expectations of duty, privacy, and royal life. Diana entered the institution as a young woman whose life changed almost overnight. The two were expected to represent stability while privately struggling with pressures neither could easily control. Then the attention intensified. Diana's popularity became extraordinary. Crowds gathered for her. Photographers pursued her. Newspapers discovered that pictures of her could command enormous attention. Her private life stopped being private. Charles, meanwhile, was increasingly exposed through stories about the marriage and his relationship with Camilla. By the early 1990s, private conflict had become public combat. The marriage was failing in front of the entire country. The 1992 separation made the situation official, but it did not end the struggle. Charles later admitted adultery. Diana would eventually speak publicly about the marriage. Each revelation pulled another curtain away, creating fresh pressure. Then came the interviews. Then came the tapes. Then came the documents. And eventually, one apparently official piece of paper would help open a door to Diana that should never have been opened that way. That piece of paper was not genuine. It was fabricated. And the person who saw it first was not Diana. It was her brother, Charles Spencer. That detail matters because Spencer was one of the people Diana trusted most. Whoever wanted access to her understood that getting directly to Diana would be difficult. Getting through someone she trusted was another matter. According to the later Dyson investigation, Martin Bashir used false documents to convince Spencer that people around his family were receiving secret payments for information. The documents created an appearance of betrayal. They suggested that the people closest to the family could not be trusted, and that was only the beginning. Once Diana believed that people around her might be reporting on her, the walls around her became higher, trust became harder, suspicion became easier. The very behavior that frightened her could then be pointed to as evidence that she was becoming unstable. William had been a child during this period. He could not investigate documents, challenge journalists, or protect his mother from an institution he barely understood.
The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others. It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation.
He could only watch. That is why his later words carry a weight that a normal royal statement never could. When William described the fear, paranoia, and isolation he remembered, he was not describing a newspaper headline. He was describing his childhood memory of a woman he loved. And that brings the story back to Charles. Because whatever Charles felt about Diana's behavior, whatever he believed about the marriage, and whatever responsibility both carried for its collapse, the later investigation forced an uncomfortable question into royal history. What if some of the final chaos surrounding Diana had been made worse by people outside the marriage? The answer did not erase the affair. It did not erase the arguments. It did not erase the pain Charles and Diana caused each other. But it added another layer to a story that had been simplified for decades. And once that layer was exposed, William was no longer silent. The son who had spent years allowing history to speak for his family finally spoke for himself. He did not merely criticize a television interview, he challenged the legitimacy of one of the famous media events connected to his mother's life, and he connected it directly to the suffering he remembered. That was when the old story began to crack. If William was right about what happened around his mother, the public had spent decades looking at the wrong part of the picture. Because the most disturbing part was still ahead. The forged documents had already done their job. The interview had already happened. The marriage had already been pushed toward its final collapse. But the truth about how that access was obtained would remain buried for another 25 years. So if this story matters to you, do not scroll away now, because the next part reveals exactly how a single fabricated document opened the door to Diana, and what happened after that door was opened could make the entire marriage look different. The first serious warning was not a newspaper headline. It was a reaction to Diana herself. In the spring of 1983, during the 6-week tour of Australia and New Zealand, the royal couple discovered that public adoration could become a private pressure point. Crowds did not simply welcome Diana, they focused on her. At some appearances, Charles could work one side of a barrier
that I remember from those final years with her. But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions.
While attention drained toward the other side because Diana was there. He joked about it during the tour. People around him later said the joke stopped being funny. That mattered because Charles had been trained from childhood to expect a particular role. He was the heir to the throne. He had spent decades preparing for rooms in which his position was understood before he spoke. Diana was only 21, yet within months she had become one of the most recognizable women on earth. Neither of them had been prepared for that imbalance. For Diana, the attention was not simply flattering, it became overwhelming. She was still learning how the institution worked, while photographers, reporters, and crowds followed her movements. The pressure was made worse by the private difficulties already developing between husband and wife. By the middle of the 1980s, accounts of the household increasingly described two people living parallel lives. That phrase sounds mild, but its meaning was not. Separate schedules meant fewer shared moments. Separate friendships created separate loyalties. The palace could continue presenting a united couple while the people inside the marriage were increasingly operating in different worlds. Diana's struggles also became more serious. She later spoke publicly about an eating disorder that had begun before the wedding and worsened during those years. Her own description was important because she presented it as a response to a life in which she felt she had very little control. The institution controlled her schedule, royal expectations controlled her public role. The press constantly examined her appearance, behavior, and relationships. The more famous she became, the less private space she had. And the press understood exactly what that fame was worth. A photograph of Diana could command thousands of pounds. By the 1990s, the financial value of exclusive royal images had increased dramatically. That created an incentive system that neither Charles nor Diana could easily escape. Every argument, friendship, holiday, expression, and movement could potentially become a saleable story. Diana eventually learned to use that system herself. That is an uncomfortable part of the history because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. She was not merely a powerless figure being watched by newspapers. She understood that publicity could give her leverage. Charles had institutional power, courtiers, private secretaries, and established royal channels. Diana had public attention. By 1991, she had begun using that attention in a much more deliberate way. The arrangement involving Andrew Morton was unusually careful. Diana did not sit across a table from the author and give him a conventional interview. Instead, her friend James Colthurst carried a tape recorder into Kensington Palace. He asked questions connected to the project, recorded Diana's answers, and carried the tapes back out. Morton could therefore maintain that he had not directly interviewed Diana, yet the material came from her. When Diana, her true story, appeared in June 1992, the effect inside the royal establishment was explosive. The book described her unhappiness, her eating disorder, her suicide attempts, her loneliness, and the breakdown of her marriage. The public was suddenly confronted with a version of royal life that had little resemblance to the polished image presented at official occasions. The palace initially treated the book as an account assembled from other people. That position became much harder to sustain after Diana's taped words were later made public. The significance was larger than a best-selling book. Diana had found a way to speak without standing beside the author in front of a camera. Then the private telephone recordings appeared. In August 1992, a recording of a private conversation involving Diana and a close male friend was published after having been captured by an amateur radio enthusiast. Months later, another private recording emerged involving Charles and Camilla. The effect was brutal. The public was no longer being shown photographs of royal unhappiness. It was being given access to private conversations. Intimate words could be replayed, printed, sold and discussed by millions of strangers. The marriage had become an information market, and the timing could hardly have been worse. On the 20th of November 1992, Windsor Castle caught fire. 4 days later, Queen Elizabeth II described the year as an annus horribilis. Then, on 9th December, the Prime Minister announced the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. That separation created an extraordinary situation. They were living apart, publicly fighting through the press, and yet divorce was not immediately planned. Diana could still theoretically become queen. The contradiction could not last forever. Charles eventually gave his own televised account in June 1994 and acknowledged that he had been unfaithful after the marriage had irretrievably broken down. The admission transformed the public understanding of the relationship. Diana's response came later, and when she finally appeared on Panorama in November 1995, the marriage had moved beyond private failure into a direct challenge to the institution itself. But there was a crucial step before that broadcast. Diana needed to trust the person asking for access. Martin Bashir understood that. In September 1995, he approached Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, at Althorpe. The meeting was not based on a normal journalistic introduction. According to the later Dyson investigation, Bashir had used fabricated documents suggesting that people close to Spencer were receiving secret payments for information. Spencer had every reason to take such documents seriously. The documents appeared to show something happening behind the scenes. They were not real. That fact would not be fully established until decades later. At the time, however, the deception worked. Spencer introduced Bashir to Diana. That introduction changed the direction of the story. The journalist who had gained access through Diana's brother now had an opportunity to tell her things about the people around her. According to the later investigation, Bashir made several false claims involving surveillance, staff, and people connected to Diana. For someone already struggling to trust the household around her, those claims carried enormous weight. The damage was not limited to what Diana believed. It affected how she behaved. Suspicion could alter relationships. Fear could change routines. Isolation could make the next claim seem more believable than the last. The tragedy was that the public could see the consequences without seeing the cause. A frightened woman looked increasingly suspicious. A damaged marriage looked increasingly chaotic. A hungry media looked increasingly successful. Those three forces fed each other until separating truth from manipulation became almost impossible, and the children were left living inside the consequences for years after that period. And William was inside that environment. He was old enough to notice what was happening, but too young to control any of it. That distinction would matter decades later. The boy who watched his mother's final years would eventually become the man who publicly condemned the interview that had helped shape those years. But before William ever spoke, Diana sat down in front of the BBC cameras. The broadcast that followed became one of the most consequential royal interviews in modern British history. And the man who obtained it had already crossed a line that nobody watching that night could see. If you believe that a story this consequential should not be buried beneath royal silence, subscribe, Share this with someone who remembers Diana, and stay with this story, because the next chapter reveals what was said to Diana behind that famous interview, and why the consequences became far worse than anyone watching understood. The paper looked perfectly ordinary enough. That was the point. It appeared to be a bank document, the kind of paper that could make a private suspicion feel like a documented fact. In the summer of 1995, Martin Bashir wanted access to Diana. According to the later Dyson investigation, he did not obtain that access by simply asking her. He first created a reason for her brother, Charles Spencer, to believe that people around him might be selling information. The documents shown to Spencer were fabricated. They suggested payments had been made to a former security employee and implied that people connected to the Spencer family were secretly providing information. The statements had been produced by BBC graphic designer Matt Weisler, who understood them to be mock-ups for a pitch. Spencer did not know that. He had no reason, at that moment, to treat what he was seeing as a television prop. The apparent documents changed the conversation because they gave Bashir something far more valuable than a recommendation. They gave him credibility. On 19 September 1995, at Althorpe, Spencer introduced Bashir to his sister. Diana was already surrounded by people she had learned to distrust. The new journalist presented himself as someone who understood the forces working against her. According to the later investigation, Bashir then made further claims that were untrue. He told Diana that her telephones were being tapped. He claimed members of her staff and security were being paid to report on her movements. He also made false claims concerning people close to her. When someone is already uncertain about whom to trust, a claim of surveillance can change the way every ordinary event is interpreted. A phone call becomes suspicious. A staff member becomes a possible informant. A routine movement becomes something that might be reported. That is the crucial part of this story. The deception did not need to control Diana completely. It only needed to make uncertainty feel reasonable. Then Bashir had something no ordinary reporter could easily obtain: her attention, her confidence, her willingness to speak. The interview was recorded for Panorama and broadcast on the 20th of November 1995. Around 23 million people watched. Diana spoke with a directness that broke through the language normally used around the monarchy. She discussed her marriage, her mental health struggles, her relationship with the institution, and her doubts about Charles's suitability to become king. The famous line about there being 3 people in the marriage became the sentence repeated around the world. But the more consequential moment was the challenge underneath it. Diana was no longer simply describing a failed marriage. She was publicly questioning whether the man she had married was suited to become king. That was an institutional problem. For 3 years, the separation had remained unresolved. Charles and Diana had lived apart, fought through the media, and continued to occupy a strange constitutional position. Diana could still theoretically become queen. The broadcast changed the pressure surrounding the divorce. By the end of 1995, Queen Elizabeth II had written to both of them, indicating that an early divorce was desirable. The divorce was finalized on 28th of August 1996. Diana remained the Princess of Wales, but she lost the style Her Royal Highness. The marriage was finished. The consequences were not. The most important question would become whether the interview itself had been obtained through legitimate journalism. At the time, the BBC did not publicly tell viewers that the path to Diana had begun with fabricated financial documents. There was no warning before the broadcast explaining that the journalist had allegedly created false evidence to gain the trust of her brother. The interview became famous, Bashir's reputation grew, and the program received awards. And an internal BBC investigation followed in 1996. Tony Hall led that inquiry. The investigation accepted Bashir's account and described him as an honest and honorable man. That conclusion would stand for roughly 25 years. During those years, the interview became part of the permanent history of the Diana and Charles story. It was replayed, analyzed, and quoted. The words spoken that night were treated as primary evidence of Diana's state of mind and of the collapse of her marriage. Yet the foundation beneath the interview had never been properly examined. The designer who had created the documents had raised concerns. Those concerns did not produce the reckoning they should have produced. Instead, Bashir's career continued. The program made him famous, and he later worked in American network news before returning to the BBC in 2016 as its religion editor. Then Charles Spencer still had his records. He had kept his notes from the 1995 meeting. Those records preserved details about the documents Bashir had shown him and the claims made during their encounter. Years later, they became crucial when Spencer returned to the BBC with questions about what had happened. The BBC eventually commissioned Lord Dyson to investigate. The findings were devastating. Published on the 20th of May 2021, the Dyson report concluded that Bashir had acted deceitfully and had seriously breached BBC rules. It found that he had commissioned the fake bank statements and used them to gain access to Diana through her brother. The report also examined the earlier BBC investigation. Its conclusion was not merely that the first inquiry had missed a detail. It found that the investigation had been woefully ineffective. Bashir had given false information during that process, and the BBC had accepted his account. For 25 years, an institution had treated a disputed interview as legitimate, while the evidence behind the access to Diana remained buried. The BBC apologized without qualification. It returned awards connected to the program, including a BAFTA. It paid a settlement to the former nanny who had been falsely implicated by Bashir's claims. It also apologized to people affected by the deception and undertook never to broadcast the interview again. That is an extraordinary ending for a program once treated as a landmark achievement. But William's response made the story personal again. On the same day the Dyson findings were published, William issued a statement condemning the interview. He said it should never have been made and should never be shown again. More importantly, he connected the failures surrounding the interview to what he remembered from his mother's final years. He described fear. He described paranoia. He described isolation. Those words changed the focus. The story was no longer only about how Bashir obtained an interview. It was about what the conditions surrounding that interview may have done to a woman already living through the collapse of her marriage. He had not read the Dyson report as a detached historian. He was remembering the mother he had watched during those years. It did not prove that every problem in Charles and Diana's marriage had been created by journalists. It did not erase Charles's admitted infidelity or the bitterness between the couple. It did not turn a complicated marriage into a simple story of one innocent person and one villain. It exposed something more disturbing. A marriage can be genuinely broken while outsiders still make the situation worse. A person can already be suffering while someone else deliberately feeds that suffering for access. And a child can watch the consequences without understanding the machinery producing them. The forged document had opened the door. The deception had produced access. The interview had become history. The internal investigation had failed. And 25 years later, the institution finally admitted that the journalist had not played by the rules. But there was still one question that could not be answered by a report. What did William actually remember from those final years? And why did he choose those particular words when he finally broke his silence? If you want the next part of this story to be heard, instead of buried beneath the same old royal headlines, like this video, share it with someone who remembers Diana, and stay here, because the next chapter goes straight into the evidence that finally forced William to speak. The answer came with a date, 20th May 2021. That was the day the Dyson investigation was published, and the day the story surrounding Diana's Panorama interview stopped being only a matter of competing memories. For William, however, the date carried something heavier. It brought an official finding into a period he had experienced as a child, when his mother's fear and isolation had been visible to him but impossible for him to explain. The report examined how Martin Bashir obtained the interview, what he told Charles Spencer, what he told Diana, and how the BBC handled the allegations afterward. Its conclusions reached back to the meeting at Althorpe in 1995 and forward through decades of institutional decisions. But before William spoke, there was another loss that had changed everything. On the 31st August 1997, Diana died in Paris after the Mercedes carrying her crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Dodi Fayed died in the crash. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard in the front passenger seat, survived. Diana was taken to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where she was pronounced dead in the early hours of the morning. William was 15. Harry was 12. Their father had to tell them their mother was dead. That morning, the arguments about the marriage no longer mattered in the way they had mattered before. The interviews, the headlines, and the palace briefings became part of a past that two boys now had to carry without their mother. The public reaction was enormous. Crowds filled London, and flowers accumulated outside Kensington Palace. At Balmoral, the Queen kept William and Harry away from the immediate spectacle, while the country demanded a public response. That decision created another controversy. Buckingham Palace did not immediately fly the Union flag at half-mast. The royal standard was not lowered because it represents the sovereign and traditionally remains flying while the monarch is present. The Queen was at Balmoral, and the normal rules remained in place. But the public did not see a constitutional rule. They saw an empty flagpole. Newspapers turned that image into a judgment about the royal family's feelings. Pressure grew quickly. On 5 September, the Union flag was flown at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, and the Queen addressed the nation in a televised broadcast. She spoke as a grandmother. That distinction mattered because the country wanted to see the monarchy grieve in the same visible way that ordinary families grieve. The funeral followed the next day. William and Harry walked behind their mother's coffin with Charles, Philip, and Charles Spencer. The decision remains one of the most emotionally debated moments of the entire Diana story. Years later, Harry questioned whether children should have been expected to walk that distance behind their mother's coffin while millions watched. William has carried memories from that day, but the two brothers have described their childhood experiences differently. What neither could change was what happened before that funeral. Their mother's marriage had ended. Her public battle with the institution had ended. Her life had ended. But the questions surrounding the people who had helped shape the public story about her were still unresolved. For years, the Panorama interview remained part of Diana's legacy. It was treated as a historic document. The famous answers were replayed whenever the marriage was discussed. The interview became evidence used to explain Diana herself. Then Charles Spencer reopened the question. His records from the 1995 meeting had survived. They offered a contemporary account of what Bashir had shown him and what had been said. When concerns were raised again decades later, the BBC could no longer treat the matter as an old dispute that had already been settled. An independent investigation was commissioned. Lord Dyson examined the evidence. The report found that Bashir had used fake documents to gain access to Diana through Spencer. It found that his conduct had been deceitful and in serious breach of the BBC's editorial rules. Then came the second blow. The report examined the 1996 internal inquiry and found it woefully ineffective. The BBC had been given reasons to question Bashir's conduct, yet the investigation accepted his explanation and cleared him. The significance was enormous. The original program had survived criticism. It had been protected by an investigation that failed to uncover how the journalist had obtained access in the first place. That meant the public had spent years discussing Diana's words without knowing the full circumstances in which those words had been secured. The BBC apologized. It returned awards associated with the program. It apologized to people affected by Bashir's deception. It paid compensation to the former nanny who had been falsely implicated. It also apologized to the graphic designer who had created the documents and to Diana's former private secretary. The interview itself was effectively removed from the BBC's usable history. And then William spoke. His statement was unusually direct. He said the interview had contributed significantly to the fear, paranoia, and isolation he remembered from his mother's final years. Those words deserve attention because William did not say that the interview caused every problem in his parents' marriage. He did not claim that Charles and Diana had been happy before Bashir appeared. He pointed to something narrower and more disturbing. He was describing the effect of the circumstances surrounding the interview on Diana's state of mind, as he remembered it. He was also rejecting the legitimacy of the program itself. William said the interview should never have been made and should never be broadcast again. That was not simply criticism of a journalist. It was a statement about memory. For years, the Panorama broadcast had helped define how millions of people understood Diana. Now her son was saying that the process behind that broadcast was itself compromised. That forced a difficult distinction. The marriage was troubled before Bashir arrived. Charles had admitted his affair. Diana had spoken about the damage inside the relationship. The separation had already occurred. The divorce had already happened. None of those facts disappeared because the BBC had behaved improperly. But the Dyson findings changed the context surrounding Diana's final years. If she had been given false information about surveillance and betrayal while already struggling with trust, those claims could have deepened the isolation William remembered. That does not prove every fear Diana experienced was manufactured. It does establish that a journalist used deception to gain access to her and that false claims were made to people close to her. That distinction matters. It prevents the story from becoming another argument over whether Diana was right about everything or wrong about everything. She could have been living through a genuinely destructive marriage and still have been manipulated by someone seeking a sensational interview. Both realities can exist at the same time, and William's statement brought those realities together. He was speaking as an adult, but his words came from memories formed when he was a child. That is why the word isolation matters so much. Diana had fame on a scale almost nobody could understand, yet fame did not guarantee trust. The more people around her appeared to have motives, the harder it became to know whom she could believe. Her marriage had become public property. Her friendships were scrutinized. Her private conversations were recorded. Her struggles were turned into headlines. And eventually, the journalist who wanted the biggest interview of his career reached her through a chain of deception. The official investigation did not rewrite the marriage. It exposed another force operating around it. That is what William's statement made impossible to ignore. For Charles, the past could no longer be separated into a simple story about two adults whose relationship failed. His son's words brought the consequences of those years back into the present. The boy who had once watched the marriage collapse had grown into the man now asking the public to look again. And the most painful part was not that William had finally spoken. If this truth deserves to be remembered instead of buried behind the same old royal narrative, share this video and subscribe, because the final chapter asks what William's revelation really changes about the marriage that Charles and Diana spent years trying to survive. The hardest truth about Charles and Diana is not that their marriage failed. It is that the failure became a story so enormous that the people inside it almost disappeared beneath the headlines. By the time William finally spoke about his mother's final years, the public had already spent decades choosing sides. Charles had become the cold husband, Diana had become the wounded princess, Camilla had become the third person. The press had become the narrator. William's statement forced another possibility into view. A marriage can be genuinely broken and still be surrounded by people making money from the damage. Charles and Diana had serious problems before Martin Bashir entered the story. Charles admitted his adultery. Diana spoke about her suffering. Their separation became public. Their divorce followed. None of that was erased by the Dyson investigation. What changed was the understanding of what happened around Diana while she was already under extraordinary pressure. The investigation found that Bashir used fabricated documents to gain access to Charles Spencer. It found that he then made false claims that helped persuade Diana to trust him. The BBC's earlier investigation failed to uncover the full extent of that deception. For William, those findings connected to something much more personal. He had remembered his mother as fearful, isolated, and increasingly suspicious during the final years of her life. Decades later, an official inquiry confirmed that a journalist had deliberately used deception to get close to her. That does not prove every fear Diana experienced was caused by Bashir. It proves something more precise. At least some information placed around her was false, and the person supplying it had a professional reason to gain her confidence. That is why the title of this story carries more weight than a simple claim that Charles became emotional after hearing something about his old marriage. The deeper issue is what William's revelation forced the family and the public to confront. The marriage had not been a fairy tale that suddenly collapsed. It had been under strain for years. Charles and Diana entered the relationship carrying different expectations, different temperaments, and different ideas about royal life. The institution mattered. Their personal choices mattered. Then the media machine became inseparable from the marriage. Every private disagreement could become a headline. Every friendship could become a rumor. Every photograph could become evidence. Every interview could shift public opinion. Diana learned to use publicity because it was one of the few forms of power available to her. Charles relied on the institution because it was the world he had been trained to serve. Diana's death in 1997 froze that story in place. William eventually became old enough to examine those memories with adult knowledge. That is what makes his 2021 statement so significant. He was not asking the public to forget the problems inside his parents' marriage. He was asking the public to recognize that another layer existed. The Panorama interview was not obtained through ordinary journalism. The investigation found serious wrongdoing. The BBC apologized. The awards connected to the program were returned. The interview was condemned. For years, the interview had been treated as evidence of Diana's character, her state of mind, and her relationship with Charles. Then the method behind it was exposed. The evidence remained, the words remained, but the circumstances surrounding those words had changed forever. And that is where Charles enters the final part of this story. Whatever emotions he may have experienced privately cannot be presented as a documented fact unless he has publicly confirmed them. But the emotional weight of William's statement is undeniable. A son had looked back at the marriage of his parents and spoken about what he remembered from inside it. He was not simply attacking his father's past, he was describing the impact of those years on his mother and on himself. That is a very different kind of royal revelation. It does not require a dramatic confrontation behind palace doors. The public statement was powerful enough, because William's words effectively said that the story surrounding Diana's final years had been contaminated by failures that went beyond the marriage itself. And once that becomes part of the record, the old question changes. It is no longer simply, why did Charles and Diana's marriage fail? It becomes, what happened to two people when their private failure became a public industry? That last part is uncomfortable. Diana's fame was enormous because public fascination was enormous. And that fascination eventually helped turn her suffering into one of the most valuable stories in modern British media. The Dyson findings do not absolve Charles. They do not condemn Diana. They do not erase responsibility from either side. They force something more difficult. They force the story to become complicated again. Charles and Diana could both have contributed to the collapse of their marriage, while outsiders exploited that collapse. Diana could have made mistakes while still being manipulated. William could love his mother while refusing to turn his father into the sole villain. The deepest consequence fell on two children. William was 15 when Diana died. Harry was 12. Neither boy chose the marriage. Neither chose the cameras. Neither chose the headlines. Yet they inherited every consequence. When he spoke in 2021, he did not resurrect his mother's marriage. He questioned part of the machinery that had helped define how the world remembered her. That is why the story still matters. It matters because evidence eventually forced one of the world's most powerful broadcasters to admit that the pursuit of Diana had crossed a line. And William was there to say that the consequences were not abstract. His mother had lived through them. He had watched. He remembered. And decades later, he finally had an official finding that gave context to what he had seen. William's statement left one question alive: how much of Diana's suffering had been understood, and how much had been deliberately intensified? So when the title asks why Charles could not hold back tears after William revealed how much nastier his parents' marriage was behind closed doors, the strongest answer is not an invented private confession. The real weight lies in what William's public words exposed. The marriage was painful. The pressure was real. The media exploitation was real. The deception was investigated. And the son who had lived through the consequences eventually refused to let the most convenient version of the story remain the only version. That is the legacy William's statement leaves behind. Not a simple story of Charles versus Diana. A warning about what happens when private pain becomes public entertainment. A warning about what happens when trust becomes a commodity. And a warning about what happens when institutions protect reputations longer than they protect the truth. If you believe William's side of this story deserves to be heard instead of buried under decades of royal gossip, prove it by liking this video, sharing it, subscribing to this channel, and turning on notifications, because staying silent only lets the same old version win. Do not leave yet, because the next video on this channel goes even deeper, and what comes next is worse, more revealing, and harder to dismiss.